Hello everybody, welcome to my AZ104 training course. This is part 2 of the series, and now we're going to get into talking about IAM basics. We're going to be talking about Azure Active Directory. We're going to be talking about Azure AD features, Azure AD tenants, Azure AD architecture, Azure AD versus Active Directory, and how to create and manage tenants. So without a further ado, let's get right into this. Let's start this lesson by talking about IAM basics. These are fundamental concepts that, when learned, will help us develop a deeper understanding of what Azure AD is and what the service does. The first topic is a principal. Principal is an unauthenticated entity that will seek to authenticate as an identity. An identity is an identity profile that is authenticated against using credentials. Authorizations are actions that are allowed or denied for an identity to perform. Once that principal becomes an identity by authenticating with credentials like a username and password, this identity will have authorizations, and these authorizations are actions that are allowed or denied for an identity to perform. A good example of this is, let's say you wanted to get some great deals at Costco, but when you approach the doorway and the gatekeeper at Costco asked for your membership card and you didn't have one, then of course you were denied access to the great kingdom of Costco. So you had to go and get a membership card, which is essentially a username and password credentials, and the moment you got enrolled, you became an identity. And it's this identity that has authorizations to access premium content and to let you do the things that you want to do that you wouldn't have been able to do without being an identity. Now that we understand IAM basics, let's go into talking about Azure AD. What is Azure AD? Azure AD is a cloud-based identity and access management solution for the Azure cloud. Azure AD is an identity repository that handles the authentication and authorization of identity resources in an Azure tenant and provides access management for cloud-based resources. It does this using something known as roles, and it's a role-based access control method that we will cover in these upcoming lessons. Now, let's go ahead and talk about some of the Azure AD features. Azure AD is an IAM platform. It provides identity and access management to Azure cloud-based resources. It also has enterprise access features and allows for the management of security of applications and devices. It has identity integration features such as hybrid identity and single sign-on through Azure AD Connect and Azure AD Domain Services. It also has identity security features that protects identities through multi-factor authentication and Azure AD PIM. It also allows for collaboration features through the user of the Azure AD business to business and provides development related features for Azure AD B2B and B2C collaborations. It boasts monitoring features such as audit logs, security monitoring, identity protection, and risk management. Now that we know some of the main features of AD services, let's talk about some of the Azure licensing features. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this chart, and we don't really need to waste our time memorizing all of it. I will, however, point out some important features that may or may not be on the exam. I've highlighted these key features in my hot pink Barbie highlighter. As we can see, a fee a free Azure license offers 500,000 directory objects, whereas any other license offers unlimited. Every license, including free, offers B2B collaboration via inviting guests into our Azure AD tenant. They are only offering dynamic groups and conditional access in the premium P1 and P2 license tiers. So let's talk about Azure AD tenants now. An Azure AD tenant is an individual service instance of Azure AD. A tenant represents an organization via a domain name. A tenant can have a trust relationship established with many subscriptions, but a subscription can only trust one Azure AD at a time. An Azure AD tenant is created when we create an account. Our primary account credentials represents the identity object for our global administrator, the equivalent of the root user for our Azure AD tenant. So we can create an Azure subscription, and the primary account credentials are what represents our global administrator. And the global administrator has the ability to create other identity resources such as users in our Azure Active Directory tenant. And then we have an Azure subscription that contains our cloud-based resources such as resource groups, that contains resources such as virtual machines, virtual networks, and their ancillary components. Now we can provide access to the subscription for our identity resources, but we must first establish a trust between our subscription and our Azure AD tenant. Once we've done this, we can give our identity resources, any Azure AD tenants, access to the cloud-based resources inside of our subscription. Now, let's compare Azure Active Directory and standard Active Directory. AZ AD is not a replacement for Azure Active Directory. Instead, oftentimes as cloud administrators, we would integrate Active Directory on-premises solutions with Azure AD for a hybrid environment. So as we can see, Azure Active Directory doesn't have organization units, they don't have GPOs. It uses SAML or WS Federation, OpenID or OAuth for authentication. They have a flat directory structure, internet-based identity solutions. They're scalable, available, and fault tolerant, whereas our standard on-premises Active Directory does have OUs and GPOs. It uses Kerberos for authentication, uses LDAP and TLM. It's hierarchical, and standard AD does not provide any cloud solutions unless it's part of a hybrid environment. So what do we need to memorize here? Well, Microsoft cloud-based offerings that use Azure AD for IAM include Azure, Microsoft 365, Microsoft Intune, and Microsoft Dynamics 365. It's important to point out that Azure AD is not AD on Azure. It cannot be used to extend an on-premises AD forest, and it is not even the same service as Active Directory. Azure AD is just a solution for identity and access management for cloud-based resources on Azure. I hope I provided some value in this video, and I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'll see you on part 3.